Welcome everyone to the 14th Marfield Prize celebration. I can't believe it's already been 14 years. It started in 2006 and now we have the 14th winner. Good evening everyone and good afternoon to Andy, and good morning if anyone else is somewhere else. Um, we're going to celebrate the awarding of the 14th Marfield Prize to Andrew McConnell Stott for his fascinating book, What Blessed Genius? The Jubilee That Made Shakespeare. So first, on behalf of the Marfield Committee and the members of the Arts Club, I would like to convey my deepest sympathies to Marilyn Cox and her family for the passing of her husband, Nick Cox. We all have very fond memories of them at the club, and we mourn Nick's passing. Marilyn Cox was pivotal in the creation and the success of the Marfield Prize that began in 2006 when it was originally called the National Award for Arts Writing. She organized the award and she raised a lot of funds and helped the future of the Marfield Prize in order to sustain it for many decades into the future. Now we are in our 14th year of the prize. The award recognizes the author of an outstanding nonfiction book about the visual, literary, media, or performing arts. And this $10,000 prize is designed to recognize excellence in arts writing for a broad audience and celebrates prose that is clear, eloquent, and inspiring, creating a strong connection with the arts and artists. We can be proud to say also that the $10,000 prize has helped past winners write more books about the arts, which is part of the mission of the Marfield Prize. So 14 years later, since the Marfield Prize was born, we have bestowed more than 200,000 worth of prizes. But we must not forget the regal origin of the Marfield Prize. And this began with a generous donation by Jeannie Marfield, who in 1984 bequeathed the initial endowment that established the National Award for Arts Writing, which we would later affectionately call the Marfield Prize. And in her will, she wrote, "It is my wish that these funds be invested and that the income only be used for an award to such person selected annually by the club for his or her ability and excellence in writing." And Jeannie Marfield wished to honor early and longtime Arts Club members Helen Campbell Wharton and Florence Berryman. And you can find their photos in our website, but their paintings, a watercolor painting of Helen Campbell Wharton and a portrait of Florence Berryman hangs at the Arts Club today. So in normal times, the winning author would be invited to Washington, D.C. So Andy would have been in Washington, D.C. now and stay for 2 days residency that includes the award ceremony, actually 2 days of partying, a presentation to a D.C. public high school, and a public reading at the Arts Club of Washington. And all the expenses would be paid by the club. And by the way, so Andy and I last week met up also by Zoom to more than 60 students at the School Without Walls, where Andy talked about his writing experiences and about the book. So it was very interesting. Unfortunately, due to several crises that we are currently experiencing, we are unable to have a physical gathering at the club. But as artists, we can also be creative, and as such, we have this Zoom meeting, and which seems to be working perfectly. I would like to thank the Marfield readers. We had over 50 this year who reviewed the submitted books, and they were very important for us, the Marfield Committee, in deciding the finalists. I would also like encourage everyone to listen to Maryland Poet Laureate's Grace Cavalier's interview of Andy. So Grace Cavalieri interviewed Andy, I believe mid-May and then she has her own podcast, and the podcast is linked in our website, so you can find it there. So together with us tonight is Henry Sinkovitz, the president of the Arts Club, and Henry will say a few words, and I'll pass the Zoom mic to you, Henry.
Well, first of all, thank you, Ida. I'm hoping you can hear me. There's a bit of an echo. I think it's the echo of the house being lonely for all of you. Sitting here, I'm standing here actually, in the McFeely Theater, in the theater space. And I think we're all going through some very strange times. I mean, this is a little bit of a different ceremony for all of us. Different because we're not here together. Different because we've got to have social distancing in place. Different because we're not able to celebrate a wonderful author and an incredibly good book. And at the same time, celebrate all the efforts and the work that this entire community has done to try to get this prize awarded. I mean, because this is one of those things that really brings this club together as a community. I mean, with Ito, and I see Bob Sikeli, and I see Skip, and I see Michael, and I'm trying to see the other names because it's a little bit distant. So I see Jeffrey on here. I see Dort, and Judith who have been on the committee, and obviously Lawrence, who have really kind of made this prize what it is, which is a culmination, I think, for authors on just the writing that they have done that's accessible to the public. However, this ceremony is also somewhat similar, because what it does is we're being brought together as a community. And I think we recognize, especially here in what I am now looking at as a plywood architectural feature-laden portion of the district. And Martin knows what I mean because he was here earlier, and you see just plywood all over Foggy Bottom and going straight down to what is now called Black Lives Matter Plaza. But why this is so similar is that what we're doing is part of that healing process for this nation and this community. And I really want to just say thank you all for being here and doing this and for this beautiful piece of work. I mean, the club is what we've all made it. And I'll be honest, on some levels, this has been a very stressful year with a pandemic and construction, and as well as now some things keeping us closed. But it's stuff like this, and really with the leadership of the literary committee for some of these other events, and Ito with this event, this is the stuff that is keeping us together as a group. And I just want to say my heartfelt thanks to all of you for being part of this and being part of this crazy journey we're on right now, and enjoying what this really means, and that's arts and the embracing of who we are as people. So Ito, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to this. I'm going to go off camera for a little bit, but I've got my funky headsets on, and I'm going to be really rude at dinner because we're actually doing dinner here tonight. So your dining options are now open again. So thanks.
Yes. Thank you very much, Henry, and enjoy dinner. So for tonight's program, Andy will, of course, be interviewed by Peter Marks. Peter was one of the judges who decided the winner for this year. The other two judges were DC novelist Lou Bayard and Haitian-American multi-awarded fiction author Edwidge Danticat. So Peter, as I'm sure everybody knows, is the chief theater critic at the Washington Post for almost 2 decades. He graduated in Yale University with a BA in English. That's Peter. I think Peter started at the Washington Post in 2002. So previously he worked for more than 9 years at the New York Times, where he was a drama critic, theater reporter, Metro reporter, and national correspondent during the 2000 presidential campaign. He was also a feature writer and reporter at Newsday, where he was a member of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for spot news reporting. He has chaired the Pulitzer Prize drama jury 4 times. I would encourage everyone to read Peter's articles at the Washington Post. It's really very interesting. So now I give the Zoom mic to Peter, and you can introduce Andy. Where's Peter?
I have a technical issue. Can you hear the FaceTime call that I'm stuck on?
You seem to be fine.
My daughter, who is in Brooklyn, calls me every night, is FaceTiming me, and I can't stop the damn FaceTime from ringing. I have no idea what's going on.
It's part of the program to have all of these interesting technical issues.
Talk among yourselves for a minute.
If you answer the phone, it'll stop ringing.
Yeah, just answer the phone, and then if you get logged out, just log back in. So while we're waiting for Peter to come back, actually, why don't we have Andy read a passage from the book?
Sure.
Andy,
absolutely.
are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I would be very happy to do that. I'll read something from the beginning, maybe.
Peter's there. Peter's just muted.
Oh, yeah,
Peter's...
he seems to be talking to his daughter.
Okay.
Could be talking to his daughter. Yeah. Go ahead, Andy.
Shall I go ahead? Okay.
Yeah. Just a short passage.
Okay. This is from What Blessed Genius, the Jubilee that made Shakespeare. So this is right from the beginning. King George III was not mad about Shakespeare. Was there ever such stuff as the great part of Shakespeare, he complained to the novelist Fanny Burney, listing all the characters and plays he objected to? Only it's Shakespeare, and nobody dare abuse him. One should be stoned for saying so. But why would the king, a monarch with dominion spanning 5 continents, need to hide his opinion of a playwright? Yet at the time of this royal confession in 1785, Shakespeare had attained near godlike status, and harbouring an opposing view ran the risk of seeming like a lunatic. Such veneration was still relatively new, the result of a period of intense cultural and artistic focus that had transformed Shakespeare from one writer among many to the blessed genius of the Isle. While this transformation occurred over several decades, one event stands out as the moment at which his ascension into national icon and literary deity was finally realised, the Shakespeare Jubilee of 1769. Following Shakespeare's death in 1616, after 2 decades working in London as an actor, manager, shareholder, and playwright of the King's Men, his plays fell very quickly from the repertoire. Were it not for the outbreak of civil war in 1642, they may never have survived at all. The war brought public entertainments to a halt, and with them a rich theatrical tradition that had been evolving since the Middle Ages. When the theatres reopened with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the new king, Charles II, gave the job of reviving the theatre to 2 of his loyal courtiers, presenting each man with a royal patent to open a playhouse. With no new plays and few experienced actors, the task was a challenging one. And skip ahead there. William Davenant received the patent to perform Shakespeare's plays, and he got more than he asked for. As Shakespeare's plays had first debuted when Davenant's audience's grandparents were children, it was clear that he would need to revise heavily, and this is what he did, changing endings and updating themes to suit the newness of the age, adding music and spectacle to exploit the technologies available in the new theatres, and introducing new characters and subplots, especially ones that emphasized another innovation, female actors in female roles. Davenant even conflated 2 plays to make one, all the while making sure to plane the knots and tubercles from Shakespeare's original language that sounded archaic and tortuous to the Restoration ear. The result was a resounding success, as epitomized by his 1664 production of Macbeth, which featured flying witches, songs, dances, and a happy ending accompanied by a semi-operatic score. this Macbeth was not a Shakespeare play so much as a Shakespeare-inspired entertainment, one that had the contradictory effect of elevating Shakespeare within the culture, even as its popularity was based on how far it had moved away. Okay, so that's a little taster, and perhaps we'll now move on.
Yes, I've solved my FaceTime fiasco.
Excellent.
The timing.
That's part of the Jubilee.
Yeah,
That's right.
exactly. Boy, does that set us up perfectly. Thank
Yeah.
you, Eno. And that was a lovely passage from the book, Andy, which I must say thrilled everybody on the jury. I was going to ask you to sign my book after this Zoom session. Hang around afterwards. That would be fantastic.
Yeah, next time.
Yeah, unfortunately. But I'm thrilled to get to talk to you, Andy. And one of the joys of being on the panel was the expectation that I'd get to hear you talk a little bit more about What Blessed Genius, because it gave me so much pleasure. And of course, I have to thank both the Arts Club and the Marfield readers for giving us such a great selection of books to read over a period when we needed things to read. So it all worked out for us delightfully. And Andy just enhanced the experience by giving us a book that was so rich in historical detail and at the same time enormously entertaining. That combination, as any writer knows, is not an easy feat. And as you just heard in just one of the short passages that I got to hear again in part, there's every page of this book. There is no time wasted. There are revelations and the interpretive value of Andy's exploration of 1769 and the Jubilee is just incredibly edifying. So Andy, what was it about this Jubilee, this event that the great Shakespearean actor David Garrick sort of spearheaded, that got you, that piqued your curiosity, your scholarly curiosity?
Peter, thank you so much. And also, I would also like to sort of formally thank the Arts Club and the Marfield Literary Committee for honouring me in this way. It really is a great and unexpected honour, and I'm so very grateful for the attention and kind words that you've paid to the book. So I'm really interested in a couple of things in theatre history, and the Shakespeare Jubilee had them all. So one is I'm really interested in, if you like, the sort of forensic history of celebrity and how people become elevated to these really sort of high cultural status, and how that might happen. When we begin to excavate the sort of histories of people's ascensions to fame, very often you'll see some accidents, you'll see some social forces at work, and you'll also see something else I'm very interested in, which is the relationship of art and commerce and the way in which those two things interact, and how, behind every kind of great sort of cultural artistic event or moment, there is a financial or budgetary plan. Somebody has fiduciary responsibility for the thing, and sometimes this goes well and sometimes not so well, and so that leads me on to the third thing I'm interested in, and maybe this is something to do with my damp British soul, but I'm interested in bathos and things that are ultimately sort of heroic failures. And the Jubilee is a heroic failure on a grand scale that ironically had absolutely the effect that they wanted it to have, which was to propel Shakespeare into the stratosphere as the world's greatest writer, while at the same time being an abject disaster. So, it was a fascinating contradiction, and I love 18th century history, and some of my favorites were there, and everybody was there in this sort of capsule moment, and it just seemed like a wonderfully sort of a wonderful little bubble to write about, and you could write quite a short, fun book about that 3 days.
Yeah, that's a wonderful description. I love forensic history of celebrity. That's a great way to like encapsulate what fascinated you, and it hooked me too. Uh, the story itself for me, Andy, had almost a kind of, it was sort of Henry Fielding and Tom Stoppard. You know, you could see it you could actually see a play
Mm-hmm.
being performed
Mm-hmm.
about this experience. It's just that sort of, it has that sort of signature moment, and it's wonderful to think that this failed publicity event, in a sense, was the thing that in the long term had this amazing effect on culture and on our sort of appreciation of Shakespeare. Maybe if you could describe a little bit, Andy, because I'm not sure people understand what changed in terms of the perception of Shakespeare before this
Mm-hmm.
and in the ensuing years. This idea, I guess, that he was sort of the playwright laureate of England was
Mm-hmm.
not widely sort of acknowledged in the world, or
Mm-hmm.
was it just that was he just considered kind of a boulevard sort of dramatist, the way many others were scribbling in the period?
Yeah, it's really fascinating. So I mean, I guess many of us have just sort of grown up in this world where there is this, just acceptance, this orthodoxy that Shakespeare is the literary genius that transcends all. Right. Certainly in my upbringing, I knew that long before I had ever read a line of Shakespeare, and I just received it through osmosis, right? Without, it wasn't like I lived in a house in which everybody's spouting Hamlet all the time. I mean, it was just one of those things you pick up just from walking down the street almost. And so I'm very interested in how that happened, and as I alluded to in the short passage I read. After his death in 1616, the plays fell out of the repertoire immediately. And I mean, I think we can understand why, because, the theatre of the Elizabethan and Jacobean era was a theatre of novelty and newness, right? And it's not like Broadway or London's West End, where a play can have a run in a theatre that can potentially last years if it's a success. But rather, they would perform a new play every night, and 5 nights a week, and the plays would maybe be on for 2 or 3 weeks, and then they would fall out of this continual repertoire that was in constant rotation. And so post 1616, they're looking for the new thing. This is more like contemporary television, if you will, because the audiences post Shakespeare were interested in watching things that spoke to them directly and were brand new. And Shakespeare was their grandfather's playwright, not theirs.
Right.
And so this is the case through the first part of the 18th century, and it's only really with the career of David Garrick, who's the most famous sort of actor and theatre manager and an all-round auteur, where Shakespeare becomes revived, and it's partly a response to a European literary culture that's very much dominated by the French. And England at this time is obviously at war with France, and is trying to define itself and its culture and its literary arts in contradistinction to French things. And so it goes looking for something domestic, indigenous, homegrown. They revive Shakespeare with this kind of sense of nationalist pride, and then David Garrick seeks to take it upon himself to be the principal interpreter, the guardian, the protector, the person who is comes to be ultimately understood as the sort of high priest of Shakespeare, who's defending his honor, and he does it very curiously. By completely changing Shakespeare, right? So he makes Shakespeare fit for his audience because, again, an mid-18th century audience finds Shakespeare to be imperfect, hackneyed, archaic, difficult to understand, obsessed with unhappy endings. And so Garrick does all these revisions, and people really appreciate it. They say, you've improved Shakespeare, you've made it better. And so then now that we have this more digestible Shakespeare that people enjoy, he really starts to take off, and the British theatre-going public really start to identify with Shakespeare as their national poet. And the Jubilee was really the signature event that was meant to cap this, and was intended as 3 days of celebration of Shakespeare in the place of his birth, Stratford-upon-Avon, that was really going to be the event that was the crowning of Shakespeare, you know, the inauguration of him in this deified state. And that's why they all descended on this small town in Warwickshire in order to make that happen.
Yeah, there's so many wonderful elements to this to explore. One of them being your descriptions or your research into what Stratford-upon-Avon, now sort of a mecca, you know, for Shakespeare lovers, and a very sophisticated tourist destination, including obviously the home of the RSC, and you know, and Anne Hathaway's cottage. I mean, everything now is kind of a landmark. At that time, the way you described it is it was this hick town where the residents really didn't even have much appreciation for Shakespeare themselves, didn't really acknowledge what they had, the earning potential they had in their midst to make something of Shakespeare. And these rubes, so to speak, became sophisticated, it seems, or more sophisticated once the swells descended on them to understand what they had in their pockets, or potentially in their pockets, which I thought you just so beautifully rendered this diametrically opposed groups, the locals and the rich and the literary crowd that came into
descended from London. Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that we're right at the beginning. You know, the Jubilee. I'm not sure I can verify this claim, but I'm fairly confident in saying that the Jubilee is the world's first literature festival. Let's say it's the Western world's first literature festival. And so, you know, you don't have a tradition or a culture of literary pilgrimage, right? You have religious pilgrimage in Catholic countries, but you don't have a kind of secular equivalent in which, you know, you might, you know, you would go to Stratford-upon-Avon, or, you know, you would go to the house of, you know, I used to get dragged around these as a kid, you know, you go and, you know, go to Henry James's study and sort of stand there and try and absorb the genius, and it, you know, it ineffectually so. But this was brand new. And so the Stratfordians just lived in their little village. You know, and they had this guy that some people used to mention, but there was really no you know, sort of practice or habit of charging people to show them around that birthplace, or, you know, introducing them to, you know, gardens in which he may have sat and contemplated his verse or anything like that. So you know, and bear in mind also that the verifiable facts of Shakespeare's life can really be written on the back of a postcard. Right. So it's not like there were these sort of shrines or these documents or these things. And so, I mean, in some ways, that, I guess, was an opportunity ultimately, because people could fake a lot of stuff. So that was...
Well, that was wonderful. One of those, you had that sort of section. I think people were selling pieces of their furniture and claiming it was Shakespeare's, or there was like, they were like sort of relics that they were sort of making up as they went along to make some coin off this event.
That's absolutely right. And there was a couple of things. One was the famous mulberry tree, which Shakespeare is supposed to have planted in the garden of his house, New Place, right, which was then cut down by a dyspeptic owner of New Place, who was so annoyed that tourists kept cutting sprigs from it that he decided to chop it down as a way of just stopping people from trespassing on his territory, which I'm sure if you tried to do now, you know, you'd end up in the Tower of London probably. But but also, you know, there's a nice little vignette I enjoyed at the end of the book when, you know, post Jubilee, the tourist industry is starting to pick up. And the owner of the birthplace at that time is showing a rich Londoner around and says, "Oh, this is Shakespeare's chair, you know, admire Shakespeare's chair." And the Londoner says, "Oh yeah, that's really nice." And so she proceeds to kick out one of the struts that's holding it up and then hands it to him and sells it to him for £10. So it's a, you know, there's a sort of wonderful trafficking in these relics. At one time, you know, there's this great reverence for them, but also really kind of, you know, manhandling them in a way that we wouldn't, you know, curators of museums would not be pleased.
You know, it's. I think, you know, your allusion to like literary festivals rings true. I wonder if it's almost the progenitor of the Oscars in some weird way. I mean, the parties that are surround an event celebrating the art. The whole history of creating a huge publicity storm that attracts the celebrities of the period who all want to be seen as celebrating, and it sort of lifts them up. All has a connection. It may have started that, you know, it may have started what we consider now like de rigueur kind of award ceremonies.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I like that. And one of the interesting things about it is all of the motives, very individual motives that the attendees had. So you're right, you know, some people came out of a genuine love for Shakespeare and a desire to celebrate a poet that meant something to them. Everybody else came because everybody else was going and it was the thing to do and it was being written about in the paper. You know, fathers took their eligible daughters looking for husbands, you know, everybody showed up hoping to get into the paper. James Boswell, who I write about a lot, who I'm very fond of as a character in 18th century history, you know, purely went for the purposes of self-promotion, you know, and he himself had just authored a book which had been recently published, which was about his trip to Corsica. And so he went to a Shakespeare festival dressed as a Corsican freedom fighter and then wrote poems about Corsica that he had printed in the paper. So, I mean, it was so far removed from anything to do with 16th century drama that it was just ludicrous. So it really was a PR stunt in which everybody got a lot from it. But I think the thing that's really interesting about it is, of course, it was a Shakespeare festival, but not a single scene of Shakespeare's was performed, let alone a whole play. Right, so Shakespeare's actual work did not exist or manifest itself except in a series of echoes and allusions and, you know, paintings or people dressing as Falstaff. You know, it's not like if you went to, you know, the RSC Shakespeare festivals in Stratford now, for example, you know, you'd sit through 3 days of back-to-back performances, but you know, it wasn't like that at all. So they really kind of got to the essence of what it was all about, which is celebrating Shakespeare while having a really good time.
There, you know, that's wonderful. The other thing, you know, I mean, it seems to me that you document so much of the jealousy, the envy, maybe the resentment of Garrick for doing this. Not only it wasn't as if it was this everyone went to see a huge success. You almost feel as if they willed it to be a disaster, which it was. Where did you go to find all this out, to discover this? Was it readily available in archives? I know you used a lot of newspaper accounts of the period, but where did you actually go to glean the information?
So I did a lot of research in the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon, you know, and having finished up for the night, I would go for a pint of Shakespeare's ale in a Shakespeare-themed restaurant and have a Shakespeare-themed dinner and pay a royal price for it all. So, you know, that spirit continues very much. So the archives of the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust were important. The Folger Shakespeare Library in DC has a lot of material also, and they indeed have Garrick's chair made of mulberry wood.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so one can go and see that. And actually in Stratford, in the library there, they have a lot of the, what would you call it, merchandise that you could buy, you know, the ribbons, the handkerchiefs, you know, the ceremonial or commemorative booklets, all of that kind of stuff. So that's really fun to see. And then a lot of the newspapers, I mean, the really interesting thing about British newspapers in 1769 is there was just so many of them. There was, you know, sort of 20 odd dailies in London alone, plus all of the major cities had them, plus many of the regions would have magazines that had a great deal of sort of literary and cultural material. And so these are very, you know, sort of, you know, they're great sort of volumes for lovers of gossip and the liberal arts, because they're filled with, you know, sort of news from abroad and diplomatic letters and stuff that's going on in court, but then lots of book reviews and theatre reviews and, you know, just all this kind of a real rich sense of a kind of shared cultural participation, which I think is great. But they also were, they could be really quite mean to each other, and they were rivals, and they liked to undermine each other and accuse each other of all kinds of crimes of egomania and pomposity and things like that. And Garrick was a very, very successful and influential man. He was probably the most famous man in Britain after the king himself. And, he had rivals. This was a theatre industry in which people wanted to make money and be famous and be celebrated and get close to the aristocracy as a result, because they were great patrons of the arts. And Garrick had done that very successfully. He was extremely good at ingratiating himself with people. He was very witty, very charming, very talented man across many different areas. And so, people wanted to take him down a peg or two. And so when he announced this sort of quixotic enterprise in Stratford-upon-Avon, a lot of people just went desperate for it to go wrong, because that would, they would cause some great joy.
And there's so many sort of paradoxes about Garrick. I mean, he really was the establishment, but yet he also was this innovator in terms of even his theatrical style. You describe, that he actually, for people then, they were witnessing what they thought was authentic life on the stage, which seems to have been a kind of beginning for that kind of performance. Do you have in your head a sense? Can you envision, Andy, the way in which Shakespeare was performed in that day? Because that's one of those things, we can't know. I mean, it's it's in the ether. All we have are accounts. But you do feel as if some acting historians, theater historians, seem to have some sense of how they perform. Do you have a feeling a sense in your own research how it was presented at the time?
So I think so, although it's very difficult to know how much, one is just filling in with one's own imagination and a sort of wish fulfillment to be able to go back there and see really what it was like. But I think the theatre of the 16th and 17th century obviously would have been primarily an aural theatre, right? One that you listen to, because the stage would have been very bare. The performances would have taken place in mid-afternoon in natural daylight and open to the elements, etc. The costumes were anachronistic and not really, intended to convey a sense of place with any real accuracy. And so Garrick's theatre is a move towards that more representational or mimetic theatre. So you have an indoor theatre in a proscenium arch, so it looks like you're watching a picture. You have costumes that are more accurate, however fictionalized they are. You have lighting that allows an audience to see a face much better, and the acoustics are much better. So you can, you still have to project, but you can be quieter. And that allows you to modulate in a more refined and granular way, which indeed allows you to convey a broader range of emotions. And so really that was Garrick's thing. One of Garrick's greatest innovations was continuing to act when he wasn't speaking. So a lot of performers at this time would speak their lines and then just sort of stand there, like waiting, sort of apparently sort of just waiting for their turn to perform again. Whereas Garrick continued, he would do bits of business. He would, articulate his character through his actions and the way he held himself physically, even when he wasn't talking. And so that was a great innovation. And then he also had these wonderful things that people considered to be profoundly innovative of the time, but just now seem slightly absurd to us, such as his fright wig. And his fright wig was, a periwig, as they would wear. Everybody would wear wigs of various different kinds, but he had one that had a string on it that he could pull, so that when his character was profoundly scared, such as Hamlet seeing the ghost of his father for the first time, he would pull on it and the hair would come up like this, right? So, so I mean, this was This was, and you know, to people, this was just a wonderful innovation. You know, look at Garrick's attention to detail, how beautifully he conveys the nuances of human existence. I mean, to us, it's just silly, but you know, these kinds of things, he was always trying to push that. And another thing he tried to do was just sort of change the dynamics of the auditorium itself, because this was a very noisy, garrulous place in which people, you know, sort of would treat the theatre auditorium as if it were their own living room. They would meet friends, they would eat, they would, you know, visit with one another, they would, you know, solicit one another in various different kinds of ways. And so Garrick would place people around the auditorium to shush people, so that they could focus on his performance. Right? It very much becomes his auditorium and not more of a public space in which, you know, stuff is going on and there's a play there too.
I loved, yeah. Didn't people buy tickets to like half the show? Wasn't there that?
Yeah. So they had half price, and half price. So in a 5-act play, half price you would be allowed in after Act 3. So I went to a soccer match in Rome once in the probably the late 80s, maybe early 90s, and you know, a soccer match lasts 90 minutes, and in I think minute 75 there was a flood of people because they'd obviously just opened the doors, right, so people could watch the last 15 minutes. This was the same kind of thing, because obviously you didn't always go to see the play. You've probably seen the play before because it's in repertoire. You go to see your friends, and so aristocrats especially would eat their dinner and then go to the theatre in order to conduct further business and socialize and things like that. And so, you know, people get in for half price, but it caused a terrible noise. And so those people who were trying to watch the play, you know, were suddenly disturbed by the doors opening and everybody shuffling around and moving and all this kind of stuff. And so playwrights would very often open Act 4 of a play with a synopsis of everything that had happened before, so that you could easily catch up and, you know, just sort of, you know, get this fast-paced review of the play and just move on.
You cast this book really interestingly, I would say, if I have to speak in theatrical terms. That being, you know, Garrick is obviously the center. You know, his brother plays an interesting role, the guy the agent who goes ahead of him to set this thing up. And you also chose James Boswell, to be a very pivotal figure in the book. They have a connection through Samuel Johnson, yes, Garrick and Boswell. But when you conceived the book, and you said you have an interest yourself in Boswell, was this your purging of that sort of, like, you know, desire to have him play a role in a book? Obviously, he's a fascinating counterpoint. But how did you conceive of the book when you tried to figure out how you were going to balance these personalities and convey that?
Well, I think you figured me out, actually, because to an extent I would really like to write a book about Boswell, but there's a few really good ones, so, you know, maybe there's not really a space on the shelf for another. But yeah. But I really wanted to look at the Jubilee from the perspective of the sort of the guy who was professionally committed to it as a kind of literary and theatrical exercise in genuflection towards Shakespeare, but then also from the perspective of someone who was invested in a completely different way. And for Boswell, his investment in the Jubilee is, as I said before, it's just really interested in being seen and promoting his own book about Corsica and really having a good time. So, you know, if I can maybe be a little anachronistic, I would say that Garrick is all ego in this book, right? He's all about, I'm the most important kind of cultural gatekeeper in Britain, but I'm reaching a certain age and my powers are waning, so I want to assert myself on the cultural identity of Britain in a different way than I do already, by being a tastemaker and the generator of taste. So he's ego. Boswell is id, right? He wants to go to satisfy his appetites. He's a sex addict. He's an alcoholic. He's continually wrestling with various different demons. But he's so incredibly likable, and he was such a compulsive writer of his inner life, and he really was a great sort of lover of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Enlightenment philosopher who sort of really began to write about the interior life in a serious long form for the very first time, and Boswell wanted to emanate that, but with a certain kind of Scottish pragmatism to it at the same time. So it was, and he I think we can all relate, or maybe I'll speak for myself, but Boswell will go out on a Saturday. He'll disgrace himself with drinking and the company that he keeps, and he'll wake up the next day with a terrible hangover, feeling disgusted, and he will promise that he will never do this again. He will be a good Christian henceforth, and he will always, always abide by the tenets of being a respectable person. And then by Tuesday he's embarrassed himself again, and it's and so the cycle begins. And so it's just really wonderful just sort of following that through his diaries and his letters and his journals. And he's so human and so funny, actually. And so I wanted to really sort of look at the Jubilee from the perspective of an attendee. What was it like to go? Why did you go? Right? Why would you show up for this thing?
Well, that your joy in the telling, it really comes through. I think it's why it strikes me as such a theatrical book, and why these characters almost do feel stage worthy to me. And yet I also think there's a poignance to the story because it ends in the Jubilee. Just is the natural to pick September in Stratford was the worst time of year weather-wise. Meteorologically, it was just a mistake. It poured. I mean, it was just everything that could go wrong went wrong. I'm going to ask, since I could talk to Andy for the next 6 hours. I will spare everybody that much curiosity that I have. But if you have questions. I'm going to go on gallery view here so I can see. If you have questions, please wave at us, and we'll pick you.
I think Maureen's hand is open. Maureen, do you have a question?
Just
let me ask to unmute. Yeah. There you go. I unmute. You're still muted, Maureen. While we're waiting for Maureen, does anybody else have a question?
She's ready.
I didn't have a question, but Judith does and Skip does. Their hands are up.
I have a frivolous question.
Go ahead, Judith.
Well, I love the Boswell parts too. I'm wondering, when you were at School Without Walls, whether or not the kids picked up on Boswell and his sex habits and all of. Did you get any questions?
No, it was the last day of school, and we were all on Zoom. So I don't know that they were necessarily
tuned in.
Yeah, but there was nice for many of them to come, and they will learn a thing or two about Boswell and his nocturnal habits.
Right, and the wages of sin.
Just to add to that, with the School Without Walls, I was trying to entice the kids to connect with Shakespeare by using modern actors. So we have Anthony Hopkins, who plays also Thor in this Marvel sort of Hollywood movie. So we have Michael Fassbender and stuff. But the Zoom thing was kind of a problem for some things, because the teacher had to mute them because some of them, I think she said, were misbehaving. So it was a technical problem on her part. She didn't want the kids to suddenly, they were Zoom bombing sometimes. She told me before we started. And so it was best to just mute them all.
This is the world.
Does anybody else have a question?
I have a question.
Okay.
I read a book some years back called The Shakespeare Riots, which was about the competition between two Shakespearean actors in New York in the 1820s to 1830s.
Mm-hmm.
And the book itself briefly mentioned the Jubilee,
Mm-hmm.
which I think was the crux of the start of things in New York. Was there any interplay that you came up across that involved, I guess you might say, the rest of the empire in that Jubilee year? Because by that point, of course, New York was a relatively substantial town in the context of the New World and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, interestingly enough, the Shakespeare Jubilee is definitely a response to things that are happening on a more global scale. Without question, it is a way of sort of reinforcing and consolidating some of the gains of Britain at the end of the 7
Years' War.
Yeah, and to kind of assert a kind of national prominence. The end of the 7 Years' War also expanded significantly British colonial possessions, and so then became a sort of platform or stepping stone for the empire that was to follow in the late 18th and early 19th century. Plus also, Britain at that time was going through a real political upheaval that actually, very interestingly, has a lot of analogies with Brexit, in as much as there was a real kind of wave of populism and sort of anti-continental sentiment that included a great deal of sympathy for the American colonists at this time. So we're just a couple of years away from the Revolutionary War, but not so far. And those grievances of and sort of animus towards George III and his ministers is really, has really fermented already, and the British are very aware of it. And those people who are, advocates of this kind of British populist politics are very much in favor on the side of the American colonists. So it does have a kind of broader purview. Plus, Benjamin Franklin is living in London at that time. So there is a kind of connection there also, in as much as he is really aware of the fact that the British, one of the principal modes of British political expression in 1769 is riot. Right, it's that's what they do when they have a political grievance. They go smash stuff up, and so it's a there's a lot of kind of interesting global politics that kind of feed into this moment at which Shakespeare gets elevated.
You should know, by the way, there is a play by Richard Nelson, Skip, called Two Shakespearean Actors, that is exactly about what you just described, two Shakespearean actors during the riots.
Okay.
It's a terrific play, by the way.
Of course, they burnt the Astor Theater.
So we have Amber Jones. Do you have a question? Aston, your hand is up.
Hi, this is Amber. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 I've seen a couple of presentations about the controversy, if you will, regarding the identity of Shakespeare, and I believe you made a brief reference to it in the book. I'm trying to remember. Could you address what it was like at that time and what we found when we were researching it?
So interestingly enough, so the question was about the identity of Shakespeare and some of the controversy that exists as to whether or not Shakespeare was, actually a living person, or indeed even if he was the author of these plays and poems. So interesting enough, in the sort of 18th century, this was not an issue. So there was no anti-Stratfordian controversy. Rather, there was quite the opposite, which was these writing of what ultimately are fictional biographies. So as I said, that there's very little verifiable information about the facts of Shakespeare's life, but in late 17th, early 18th century collected editions of Shakespeare, there is a sort of brief personal history of Shakespeare written by the poet John Rowe, based on recollections of people who kind of knew him or kind of knew family members, a lot of it apocryphal, that were sort of oral histories that were delivered by former actors or acquaintances or things like that. So there's a lot of, untraceable, very nebulous evidence that suggests that Shakespeare existed, and at that time what they tried to do was take these sort of vague suggestions and solidify it into a guy called Shakespeare who could then epitomize the most sort of perfect Elizabethan gentleman. Now, subsequent to that, we've had all these kind of conspiracies about Shakespeare's identity. Collectively, these people who expound these theories are known as anti-Stratfordians. I don't really have a lot of time for it, really. I guess on the one hand, I don't really care. So that's one aspect. And then on the other, and maybe I'm sort of revealing something of a chip on my own shoulder here, but a lot of the people who are put up as potential candidates as having really written Shakespeare's plays tend to be aristocrats or members of, you know, the sort of British elite in the 16th century. That kind of bothers me because, you know, Shakespeare was a small town kid from a very humble family. And the suggestion is that a kid from a humble family can't be a genius. And I want to think a kid from a humble family can be. So I'm comfortable with that reading. Yeah.
So we have Bob Kelly. Bob is also a Marfield committee, and so he was one of the group that chose your book as the finalist. So Bob has a question.
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Ido. And on behalf of all of us on the committee, Andrew, congratulations. We can't wait to welcome you to the Arts Club. You totally captivated me early on when you described the nature of the historic event that you captured in the Jubilee, in writing about the Jubilee, as something you could imagine as a Tom Stoppard play. Mm-hmm. That instantly put everything into focus for me. And I was thinking, maybe given the way the shambles that you described at the event, maybe it might be a little collaboration with a rewrite by Alan Ayckbourn here and there, perhaps. I want to ask you, okay, imagine this as a play. As Peter said, you know, Shakespeare is inspired, Shakespearean history is inspired that Richard Nelson play. If this was going to be on the West End, maybe starting out at Stratford, then moving to the West End, then a New York production with, of course, all American actors. Mm-hmm. Who would you cast as in the lead roles of Garrick and Boswell, and any other supporting?
What a question! What a question! So the dream casting, yeah. Well, I think you'd have to offer the role of Garrick first to Kenneth Branagh. He would get first dibs because he plays a similar kind of function in the 20th and 21st century as the kind of, you know, guardian of Shakespeare, or, you know, the gatekeeper.
And he's played Shakespeare.
Of course, yeah, absolutely, and so that would be wonderful. I think for Boswell, you'd have to go with a comedian. I can't think whom off the top of my head, but you would have to go for some kind of some jovial, stocky fellow.
James Corden.
Yeah.
James,
exactly.
There you go. James Corden would be perfect, actually. If he can do the Scots accent, that would be a wonderful cast. Yeah, it would be a lot of fun, you know. And the nice thing about it is it's kind of self-contained, so it's not like it's a sprawling narrative over generations or anything like that. So
it can be literally a backstage comedy.
Yeah, absolutely, and indeed, you know, the play that Garrick made out of his failure in Stratford and then put on his stage at Drury Lane kind of was a backstage view of the Jubilee. So it's already had that kind of ironic look, you know, askew at the events. So there is a sort of knowingness about the whole thing, which I think is a lot of fun.
I'm just thinking about the box office for this. Do we need a romantic interest in here? Do we need a Shakespearean actress somewhere?
We would definitely need someone very glamorous that Boswell could pine for. Somebody to play Sophia Baddeley, the most beautiful actress on the stage at that time, who also had a wonderful voice and was a very talented singer and performer. And you know, we'd have to find more for her to do on stage and have you know, Boswell follow her around like a forlorn beagle or something.
I could.
Okay, so
thank you.
Go ahead. Bob.
No, thank you.
Excellent. That's very interesting. So does anybody else have any questions? That you can unmute yourself and just talk so that we can hear you. And then, so I'm giving you permission to unmute yourselves. Okay. There doesn't seem to be any more questions.
I do have a
So
comment. It sort of ties right
Skip, yeah.
You were mentioning, Andrew, about how you like the common man, etc., making good. There's one that comes to mind in British history, which actually ties one of Brunno's movies to things. John Churchill,
Oh, yeah.
who was the grandson of yeoman and died as the Duke of Marlborough and Prince of Two. And of course, Hamlet was filmed in Blenheim Palace. It gave a job to every single member of the Churchill family. If you watch the credits,
oh, is that right?
from the Duke himself to his great grandson, who played little Hamlet. It's kind of funny, actually.
They probably don't need that kind of job creation scheme in their family, but I'm pleased they could do it.
Okay. So I think we're nearing the end. We're nearing the end, and we are now in the phase to award the 14th Marfield Prize to Andrew McConnell Stott. So without further ado, on behalf of the Marfield Committee and the Arts Club of Washington, I would like to bestow the 14th Marfield Prize Award. So I'm giving a virtual award, the National Award for Arts Writing, for your book, wonderful book, very interesting, What Blessed Genius, the Jubilee That Made Shakespeare. So congratulations to you, Andy, and if anyone else have their champagne glass or wine glass, here's a toast to you, Andy, and to your book, and hopefully you will write another book, perhaps win again the Marfield Prize. There is no rule that you can't win it twice. So we are very honored to have you and your book in the roster of wonderful winners. So cheers to you. I'm sorry that we're not able to have you in the club to have a gathering and celebrate the award this year, but we hope to be able to bring you to the club next year when we celebrate the 15th Marfield Prize Award in 2021. And I'm sure that things will have settled down, that will be possible. So I would also like to thank Peter, of course, for doing the interview and for coming tonight, and really interesting questions. I would like to thank also the Marfield Committee, the Marfield readers. We had about 60 Marfield readers this year that read all of the submitted books. We had about 70 submitted books to really parse out the finalists. And our administrators here also, Lawrence Reppert. I would like to thank also our Marfield donors, Charles Parsons, Martin Murray, who's here, Henry Sinkovitz, Mark Onmack, and Judith Nordine. And before I close, I would like to mention briefly what's happening now to our nation, because it just seems we just have to find a way to connect what's happening right now. And I feel that, as many of you might also feel, how many things seem to be falling apart. The coronavirus pandemic still lingers in the air, with many lives lost from this dreadful virus. Now we have protests and riots, not only in Washington, D.C., but around the country. And in these times of crisis, the arts is what binds us together and makes us understand that these things will eventually die down and will go back to normal, where we can do arts again. Shakespeare wrote a lot of things about the arts, but let me paraphrase one that's short and sweet. And he said that the arts give lifelessness life. And I think what he means with that is that the arts, it is what keeps us together. The arts give us hope and healing. The arts provides a pathway for us to come together as a community. So I'm sure that soon enough, we will all be gathering again at the Arts Club and freely embracing without having to fear of anything happening afterwards. So I would like to thank everyone again for joining us tonight. Stay safe, God bless, and I look forward to seeing everyone at the Arts Club soon. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, everybody. Well said, Ito, and thank you all so much. I really appreciate everything, and this was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.